Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings, Team Krulak community. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, call sign Kiwi, Operations Officer here at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have any questions, please type them into the group chat, and then I'll go through them in the order that they're received. So with that, the National Defense Strategy here in the United States placed China as our pacing threat, and there's been a strong focus because of that into the Pacific, especially for the Marine Corps as it makes changes to its organizations via Force Design 2030, so it can figure out how it wants to operate in an A2AD environment that we expect in the first island chain and out to the second. But while our focus is on China in the Pacific, I keep wanting to say specific, in the Pacific, we know that they are spreading influence other places as well, like setting up a naval base in Djibouti, along with some other actions that they're doing. So today our focus is going to be on European security and China. So today we have a returning guest to the Brutecast, but this time she returns as a non-resident fellow. She was last with us in May of 2022, where she focused on talking about humanitarian law in Ukraine, and what then was still a very early portion of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. So welcome back, Dr. Joanna Siekiera. She is currently a legal advisor for the NATO Stability and Policing Center. She did her PhD studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand and defended her PhD at the Warsaw School of Economics in Poland. She's been part of a Polish diplomatic missions to Canada and Estonia, and she's authored 8 books, over 100 publications in several languages, which is pretty impressive. 40 legal opinions for the Polish Ministry of Justice on international law, international relations, and security. And her areas of expertise are the South Pacific region, Pacific Ocean governance, and the law of armed conflict, especially when it comes to the NATO legal framework, Central Europe, security, and the South Pacific, along with gender and armed conflict. So thank you, Dr. Siekiera, for taking the time out of your day today to talk to us about what is an important topic.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I feel honored to be back. Thank you, and dzień dobry from Poland. So should I begin, or would you like to say a few words about the topic itself?
So I think we can just jump right into it, because honestly, my knowledge of China in general has mostly been focused on the Pacific, South China Sea, First Island Chain, and what the Marine Corps is doing there. I personally have not seen a lot of discussion about what they're doing in Europe. I know the Belt and Road Initiative they have kind of has them spreading out all over the place. And I know specifically about the one in Djibouti, because my time spent in Djibouti, I had to fly around that base almost every day. So while I was there, so that's been kind of my extent of experience with China outside of the Pacific.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I discussed the topic, so European Union and then China, I knew that there will be heavy stuff, but the more I researched and prepared, some new examples popped out. And this is unbelievable how the topic is relevant, yet this is not research, this is not presented, this is not widespread known in media or among politicians. So again, when I always say that there is an elephant in the room and it's money, and when it's a big elephant in the room, that is Chinese money. So this is basically what we observe here in Europe. And when I say China, I mean the Chinese Communist Party. And I always say this publicly on NATO briefings, conferences, or even last evening at the Polish television, that this is the biggest threat for us, and not only North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but entire Western civilization, based on Judeo-Christian values, where human life is put at the top of the legally protected norm. So where the principles of rule of law, respect for human rights, transparency of functioning of governmental bodies, they all guarantee stable and prosperous existence of states and their citizens. So how we here in Europe see China? Is it a threat, a near-peer competitor, a primary competitor, or maybe an economic ally? Well, exactly as I was brutally honest in the first broadcast last year, and here my big thanks and regards to Lieutenant Colonel Curtis Kjobek, Director of Operations at the Marine Corps University, who invited me, and then I re-invited him to my NATO project, but also to present here Major Ian Brown, former host of the broadcast. We should avoid political correctness, because this is very much present and in the Western countries of Europe. And here I want to make this division, that approach which we have here in Central Eastern Europe is far different. Why? Of course, because we do understand what communism is, what communism brings, and that's why we have slightly different lens when we talk about Russia, but also China, and I will move to that. I will give also my own experience as an international lawyer. I travel a lot because I understand that we must understand the legal culture of countries, because we all have different interests and therefore interpretation of international law, but also our strategic threats to our own national and international security. But last month, 3-hour discussion among 27 heads of states of the European Union, they gather in Brussels to determine whether to change or not the current European Union strategy of considering Beijing as a partner or on certain issues such as climate change. And here, first red flag. How can we expect China to tell Europe what to do while China is the largest pollutant, is well prospering, and would never allow any other country to interfere into their national business, including climate change? Quote by the President of European Council, Charles Michel: "We should not be naive, but we should also not follow a logic of systemic confrontation." Well, I would say this is very soft language, too soft, when I will give you the examples how China is already present and is threatening European security, and again, in broader context, Euro-Atlantic security. I myself witnessed what China is capable of. Last summer, I sailed across the Pacific Ocean 2 months from Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, up to Palau, and on those 2 months expedition, I haven't seen any other vessels but Chinese. Spy, illegal, overfishing fleets, or even worse, if they were legal, it only means that Chinese are capable of drastically breaching international law order by using those poor, undeveloped countries. And this is what they started to do in Europe. And you mentioned before Africa. We can say already that China is owning Africa. They are doing the same in Oceania. But having this comparison about my beloved in the Pacific and Europe, that was very famous quote by Japanese armed forces. That was quoted by Major General Joel Vowell, commander of US Army in Japan. He said, "Japan is Poland, the Philippines is Romania, China is Russia and Taiwan is Ukraine. So I would say that this is very interesting to understand the security architecture of Indo-Pacific to the theater of operation in Eastern Europe, what we are seeing at the moment. I can tell you first. Last year, I had a call from a good colleague of mine. She works at a public tender organization at one of the well-known IGO, and she told me that a Chinese businessman unknown to her paid a visit to her and brought a suitcase. They opened it and presented US dollars. She said, no, this is not how we do the business. They returned on the other day with 2 suitcases. Of course, she said no, she reported that. But this is how Chinese do the business. This is how they corrupt. And again, we in Europe, we don't talk about that. So that's why I'm very happy and honored to say my own experiences, but also the facts I gathered for this podcast. Last month, I've been to Greece. The Piraeus port of the capital city, Athens, is the Europe's biggest passenger port and the second largest in the entire world. Built by whom? Chinese. The Chinese state-owned COSCO Shipping Limitation Company. COSCO Shipping is the largest, or at least among the largest in the world. Chinese companies have, over the past decade, invaded the EU ports, airports, but also electrical companies and telecommunications. And here is that we should not be that much afraid of Russia. I mean, we European leaders, but indeed China. And I will talk more why. In February this month, I've been to Macedonia. And I observed enormous road tunnel investment projects held again by whom? Chinese, who are easily winning state tenders again. They bring their own staff, engineers with their families who follow the CCP orders. This is very much to be aware of, that they represent the system. They are sent by to Europe. Last year, I've been to Hungary. How about the example of fake Chinese passports on the black market? How Europeans are unable to trace who is actually entering and leaving the EU zone. And here we call it the Schengen zone. So I know this from top-level businessmen who earned their money in 70s, 80s, and they told me that they would be anyhow able to compete against the state apparatus from Beijing. Another terrifying fact, but I feel I have to say that, cremated bodies of Chinese citizens, they are not reported by the families of the fact of death, but their passports go back to China, and on that passport, another Chinese person is legally entering Europe. This is the procedure we have, and European agencies, including Frontex, they don't even talk about that. There is no information about that. So that's another threat. Finally, example from my own country, Poland. There are many professors, sinologists. They defend the Chinese interest in Europe. Why? Just have a look at their resumes. Grants, scholarships, fellowships, money on their voyages, book publication, they all come from China. And everything in this world has its price. We all know that. So why do I say that in Poland and Central Eastern Europe, we treat the Chinese threat slightly different? Again, unlike in many Western countries, because they do romanticize communism. We see that already now, how they treat Russia, that they focus more on the post-conflict situation to keep the trade balance. Also, they and again, I'll be talking about that, but I want you to understand that even in my part of Europe, we don't use this unacceptable term of the liberation of Europe in 1945 by the Soviet army. For us, that was just the beginning of the biggest terror, which is still unseen by many in Western Europe. And the quote of Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, personally, I hope she would be the next Secretary General of NATO. She said, with China, it's the same as with Russia. Please mind the big dependence on cheap natural resources from Russia to Germany and France, and their close economic trade balance with China. So that's why I would not even say that Western politics, Western European politics is anti-China, because here, example of Lithuania, who openly calls for self-proclamation of Taiwan. So it's not even natural. I would say this is pro-China, and the Belt and Road Initiative can only enhance that close bondage between well-prosperous Western European countries and Beijing. Please mind that last year at the NATO summit in Madrid, we adopted strategic concept finally after more than a decade. And for the first time in the alliance history, the People's Republic of China was mentioned. PRC's coercive tactics and efforts to divide the alliance. That's a very soft language, yet that was the only way to get the Chinese topic to the negotiation table. And here that was made by the Americans, for which I am grateful, because if that was only up to European part of the alliance, most likely we will end up only with Russian threat. And again, as you Kiwi mentioned, Chinese military tactics. This is very important for us to understand that in their mindset, in their doctrine, the military, therefore, armed confrontation as the last place. We must be prepared for conventional war, but it doesn't mean China will use before or simultaneously also unconventional, hybrid and irregular warfare tactics. So this is already happening at the Polish-Belarusian border. The D weapon, we know ABC weapon, but how about D, demographic, using humans against other countries? So basically regimes in Minsk and Moscow, they are trying to make this wave of illegal migrants to destabilize Poland, but also whole European Union. And we say no to that. And I don't understand why so many European politicians, and here I will quote Joseph Borrell, the European Union's foreign policy chief, from Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last month. So again, the gathering of ministers of defense from Indo-Pacific. He said, we have to work together with China in order to avoid a confrontation in the region. Well, but ladies and gentlemen, how about keeping over 1 million people in the concentration camps just because they belong to the religious and ethnical minority, Uyghurs, sterilizing women of other nationalities than Chinese, forcing abortion, abduction, mutilation, tortures, rapes, murders, child labor, organized prostitution, human trafficking, including organ trafficking, industrial, economic, and security espionage, constant military confrontation at the South China Sea and in the Pacific Ocean, establishing puppet governments across the globe, Africa and Oceania, but also South America, and making entirely dependent young and unstable governments or military coup, guerrilla groups. In my opinion, this is already a hybrid war, irregular war, however you want to call it, but for me, this is already a war. So what is China doing globally and slowly entering the old continent? Isn't it not enough to cut the economic and political ties with Beijing? Look at NATO from European perspective, because we decided that the current Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, he will stay on another cadention. So my question is, look who is voting for what. Candidature of the British Secretary of General, so Ben Wallace. He's supported by the US, Poland, the Netherlands, but not by Germany and France. Why? And again, China steps in again. Premier of China, Li Quan, visited Berlin for constant China-Germany intergovernmental consultation, very fancy name for even fancier welcome, which US Secretary of State Antony Blinken couldn't even ask for during his last visit to Beijing, more or less at the same time. French President Emmanuel Macron visited China in April, business as usual, amid Chinese destabilizing Indo-Pacific, where also French territories are located. And it was, of course, eagerly used for propaganda purposes by Xi Jinping. We in NATO need a strong leader who will not be afraid of calling the current but also future threats coming from states but also non-state actors, NSA, inside our territorial scope but also outside of it. So I always say that as much as in nature, the same in international relations, there is no place for any vacuum. Sooner or later, it will be replaced by someone or something. The US was out from the Pacific, being busy in Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and guess who used the chance and stepped in? China. So that's why I will underline that we here in Europe, we need the US, we need your hegemonic power, your military and political strength, because we are too weak. Europe does not have joint armed forces, because many countries in Europe, they are either too small to have own forces, NATO forces, or their contribution to NATO contingents, and then also European one, that would be simply too much. And also, as I pointed before, we have slightly different interest in security. So this is very important also to look from the political perspective of the European Union. And that's why Central Eastern Europe is building the bloc initiated by Poland, so-called Free Seas Initiative. Free seas from the Baltic Sea in the north, Adriatic at the west, and Black Sea at the east of Europe. Our approach to Russia is much different. Our pace of economic growth is different. We have different obstacles, also legal culture. So, and again, I will point out my own country, Poland, being the growing power of in Europe, the fastest growing economy according to CIA World Factbook. We are at the 19th place at the 19th economy globally. We are investing 4% GDP in military buildup. And again, the war in Ukraine showed that we were there first to help. We took care of more than 3 million migrants. Another 2 were just passing through our country, but we did that because we understand the Russian threat. Coming back to China, the greatest fear is in critical infrastructure. That might be taken out by China in the situation of conflict, but here as an international lawyer, I would say not only military armed conflict, but also natural disaster, also big sport events like soccer championship or pandemic. We've seen what China did during the COVID pandemic, how they benefited as the only economy, but also strategically, what I like to underline, that in a moment, just like that, China got the access to highly secured data, how many beds in hospitals do countries have, in which pace we are able to protect, how many people are deployed in security companies, what are the channels of communication between high-level people. So they were given those very detailed security data on a silver plate during pandemics. So they are more than happy to use that in the future as well. Chinese companies own or have stakes in a wide range of European critical infrastructure, including ports. Hamburg in Germany being the third busiest port in Europe, where Chancellor Olaf Scholz backed the sale. Yes, he did, despite concerns from other member states and own countries' intelligence service. That was exactly the same what they did for Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines from Russia to Germany over the heads of Poles and other European nations, who told Berlin to stop because this is a breach of European integration and solidarity, and making business with Russia, who is trying to rebuild their spheres of interest, to rebuild Balshaya Rossiya. Also, other examples of Chinese interference: airports, electricity companies, wind and solar farms, as well as telecommunication countries: Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France. But the real concern is digital and Europe's dependency on Chinese technology. Because when it comes to ports or other critical infrastructure, we can always close it down. Yet Chinese, using their access to infrastructure, can trace very easily who is shipping what, where, who will use the loss of the lack of this chain, what can be done to get the new alliance, who will lose the most from cutting those chains of transportation. So how about our European security vulnerabilities, such as 5G network, our social media accounts, bank accounts, energy infrastructure, not mentioning water works? After all, there is a possibility that it could all be just turned off altogether. Disruption to German, French, but also Polish railway systems that seems to have been caused by a cyber attack already started happening. Of course, in order not to cause a panic, media and authorities say, no, that was just a system overload or hot or cold weather. But this is clear for me that if Chinese companies, they set up and own those systems, they can easily use the opportunity to check what kind of crisis they can cause by turning off those systems. Also, minding that Chinese companies have stakes in European electric grids, renewable energy fields, and telecommunication systems, the potential for disruption is growing year by year. Letting China to enter so many strategic, critical infrastructure allows them to know who is responsible for what, which are the state official and private high investments and trade chains, as I said before, but also resources routes. They were given by us, Europeans, a map, digital map, which can be used for their own benefit and again, against us, Europeans. That's why I would always underline that, yes, we Europeans, we need the US and we need to stand for your side, not somewhere in between. We need you, and also we are too weak. The times when Europe was the center of gravity or Euro-Atlantic zone those days are gone. 21st century is the Pacific century. The attention of the world is now in the Indo-Pac. So that's why we have to be aware what is happening there, but very easily China can do, and they are trying to do the same tactics in Europe. Overall, the biggest weakness of Europe against Chinese threat is assuming very naively that they play the same game using the same methods. But here, but also I know that in the US, we must begin to use the perpetrator's lens. And this is what I was preaching at the first broadcast, that the same as we want to understand Russia war fighting in Ukraine using our own lens, this is a no-go thing. We must understand the rationale of the perpetrator, Russia, but also adversary, so Chinese Communist Party, interpreting international law and rules-based order according to their own interest. I will end up with lawfare, which is not used here in the Western world. This year, International Criminal Court issued a warrant arrest against Vladimir Putin. Totally lacking competences because Russia is not anymore a member of this court, but most likely that was done to lift Ukrainians' morale, which I do understand, but from the legal point of view, that was meaningless. Because please look at the reaction of China and Russia. The other day, after issuing that warrant arrest, Xi Jinping visited Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and those two presidents of authoritarian communist regimes announced that from now on, this is China and Russia who will be guiding and protecting international law, and they would be the ones who will secure the interpretation of international law norms. So in such world, they already announced how they see the future based on their interpretation of international law. The Western world, we, Europe and the US, stand for, it might be crushed. So that's why I am preaching that China is the biggest threat, not only in Indo-Pac, but also in Europe. I know that after every conference or interview, there are many, I would say, not pleasant comments, but I believe that we must say the truth how it is, not how we want the situation to look like. This is very dangerous and we must prepare. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will stop here. Thank you very much, and I am awaiting your comments and questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Siekiera. That was, I have a whole page of notes here. So for those in the chat, if you have a question, just go ahead and post it in the chat, and we'll go through them in the order that we receive them. If you're able to actually ask the question, I'll open up your mic so you can do that. If not, I can read off your question as well for our gracious host here or guest. So I'll start it off. So one of the things you mentioned is, the European nations don't have the same type of money that the U.S. can bring, and we talked about if there's a vacuum, China's going to attempt to fill that vacuum. So I guess my question would be is, in a world of capitalism where the dollar or the pound or the euro rules, what can be done in order to stem some of this? China is building out a lot of ports, owning airports, all the things that you kind of talked about the way that they get into a lot of these countries. So, what can we do legally that would, stem some of this, people chasing the dollar, so to speak?
So I would say this is not either or. I would say that we should invest in education, underlining values and seeing the perspectives for the future. Because when we will finally realize what is the true threat of China and Chinese money being present, it's not that they will just keep our democratic orders. No, they will impose communism on our countries back again, and we, especially now in Poland or Central Eastern Europe, we don't want that anymore. Look at Marshall Plan from America to Europe. That was given to the Western countries. We were not given that chance because Moscow said no. So this is very important to point that out. That what are the consequences if you stick to the Western world, so US, but also what if you will stick to China? And this is what we are struggling in the Indo-Pac at the moment. That, for example, again, the US woke up after Solomon Islands signed a military treaty with Beijing. This is very important, right? So we can say that exactly money is very important, but values and the prospects for the future are equally important. Those island countries, they were left alone. So who used the chance? Of course, China. So this is very important to prevent such situation. That yes, I believe that every country would have to pick a side. I'm a very pragmatic lawyer, and I would say I do not believe that countries, especially poor, can remain neutral. I simply do not believe that. So at the end of the day, and I think that the future war will happen in Indo-Pac, so that war will not only touch upon military or political influence, but also our values, civilization of the Western world. So culture we have based on Judeo-Christian values, democratic principles versus authoritarian regimes. And those countries would have to pick the side.
All right. So you mentioned about the Indo-Pac century. So do you have anything to share on what the Polish government is planning to do to increase its diplomatic and economic involvement in the Indo-Pacific region? Since I know it's all geopolitical and stuff, but we can't always be all military, since India and a lot of the Indo-Pac countries do rely on China as a main market for their raw material exports. So if we want to de-risk or decouple from China, we need an alternative to them.
Of course, definitely. And I'm grateful that you mentioned India. We need India not only as a balancer, because when I read some American commentary or analysis, there is always, yes, we need India as someone in between. And I would say, no, we need India at our side. That's why I always preach that we need Turkey at our side. You have no idea how many times I've witnessed that Turkish officers were not treated as equals within NATO. And I would say, don't do that, because they have their own pride and their own interest. If they will not be inside our Western civilization family, they will not have any problem with going to the other side, our enemies. So this is politics. Every country has own raison d'etat, which is obvious for me. And answering your question about Polish relations, first of all, with India, this is a big build-up of international relations, economic and educational trade. Even at the Trumps in my hometown, they are all sticked with Polish-Indian friendly relations. There is anniversary this year. When it comes to Oceania, I would say mostly with 4 Asia-Pacific NATO partners, being Australia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, and Japan. So those countries were invited already for the second time to Europe, last year in Madrid, this year in Vilnius for the NATO summit. So we can really see the shift that NATO countries, I mean the European parts, they are focusing on this part of the globe. So I am really looking forward more investment. Yes, I don't know yet what is happening, but I can feel that Poland is starting to use its force, being this growing superpower, economic but also military. So this time is approaching. Thank you. Yes.
Joanna, good to see you again. So my question is, there's been some reporting recently that Ukraine has been in discussions with either Chinese companies or parts of the Chinese government for prospective reconstruction assistance when the war is over, especially when in terms of communications and IT infrastructure. And I see it as it's totally understandable that Ukraine look for assistance in reconstruction from whoever's offering to help, since rebuilding is going to be very expensive. But what can Europe and or the US do to better disincentivize letting Chinese companies in, because we have a pretty strong awareness of what security risks and strings attached come with doing business with China and the Chinese government?
Exactly. Very good question. Ian, thank you very much for this. And I totally agree that Ukraine might not be fully aware of what China is capable of when they would be allowed to Ukraine, because everything what I just discussed, what is already happening in Europe, that might soon be the case in Ukraine. But in Ukraine, and I regret to say that, but this country is full of internal problems. That was the case before the war. That would be very much the case after the conflict, regardless of how this conflict will end up. So corruption, nepotism, lack of democratic rules. So from our perspective, I always say that for Poland and Central Europe, Ukraine is a buffer zone, and we need this buffer zone to be safe. Because all the ideas of having Ukraine in NATO or European Union, they are political promises far too early. For our own benefit, our own security, this is not the case, should not be brought to the table. So I would say that if the US, as the biggest contributor to Ukraine, both when it comes to money, equipment, training, know-how, it's the matter of your actually policy and contracts, because again, as a lawyer, I would say just sign a contract that only companies from the US or European Union can support you to build up the next post-conflict country, meaning that don't you even dare signing any contract with Chinese Communist Party, because we will withdraw. So again, using lawfare for our own benefit.
I think the other thing I wanted to ask, listening to the previous podcast you were on, you talked a lot about the international courts. So, you had talked about in that podcast how Russia, and I believe at the time Ukraine, were not part of the international courts. And you just talked about now, Russia is still not a part of the international courts. Has China ever been a part of that international courts? Because I know, when it came to rulings about the 9-dash line or some other elements in the South Pacific, when it comes to like Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross, the international courts have ruled against China, but are they a part of that court? It sounds like they aren't.
Exactly, a very good point. Is not a state member of the Statute of International Criminal Court, but is a member, of course, of International Court of Justice, being another tribunal within the United Nations family. And always there is a judge from Russia and China voting, of course, veto when it comes to any judgment against Russia or China. So that's another thing we must be aware, that international law, as Jan exactly called our previous broadcast, that international law is leaky, is weak, is missing sanctions in the as an element of a norm. Though I would say, okay, so we have the international law system as it is, but it doesn't mean that we cannot work on it, use it, because a few days ago in the Netherlands, in the Hague, there was established a special commission on war crimes in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, when I hear that special commission, seriously, only international tribunals like in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Tokyo, or of course starting with Nuremberg, They have international jurisdiction over war crimes, not special commissions. This is, again, I'm like, surely this, I can tell you that when Chinese and Russians in Kremlin, they heard that, they were laughing at us so heavily that we have in international law institutions in Europe, we are not using the law as a tool, as a weapon in lawfare. They are perfect in that, what they are doing, what kind of messages they are sending worldwide. And of course, we might laugh at that. We might say, no, of course, this is not that serious what they say, but look at their allies. Look at other regimes, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, countries which are not in between, but they are leaning more towards being allies of Russia or China. They follow, they see the argumentation line of China and Russia, they see the conflict in Ukraine, and they draw conclusions. How weak in international law we are, that again, I've been to conference last year on multi-domain operations. This is well-established doctrine in the US, not in every NATO country, not at all. And again, still talking so much about MDO, we are not using all the capabilities we have at the same time. It's either investing in military mindset, neglecting other domains, or putting all the money on land forces, army, again, other absurd. The enemy is not holding back, using all the assets, and we are still too weak. I think that there is still a lot we can do.
Yeah, it kind of seems like the advantages of an alliance, you can have a much bigger pot of money, a much bigger military coming together, are kind of not necessarily negated, but you get that disadvantage of you have a bunch of voices all trying to get their own way. They have their own caveats, whereas against our pacing threats, we're talking about Russia and China. That's essentially one voice, because they have very similar aims, even if they're going about them in different ways. So I guess the question would be is, how do we convince people that have different caveats to, work together better?
First of all, we should sit down and talk about that, because this is unbelievable that, as you mentioned, all NATO members and our like-minded partners in Indo-Pac, they of course focus on their own agenda. But how about looking from the broader perspective about the future warfare, again, Indo-Pac, deep sea mining, all the strategic raw materials which are at the seabed of Pacific Ocean? That would be the target of China when technology allows them to dig in, to use their resources, not only for economic advantage, but most likely military. And then after military threat, they will not hesitate to use it for civilizational benefit, to preach their own agenda. As I pointed, international law, but also their interpretation of human rights, which is just terrifying. We already see that what is happening in China, but also in Russia against political opponents. They are either poisoned or they are missing and never found. This is already happening, so that must be said out loud, so all the countries would be at the same page, because at the moment they are not. And Western countries, politicians going to Beijing and talking to dictators, being Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, just like that, that's not unity we need now.
So they ask, what do you think about the new infrastructure by China in Afghanistan?
When you say Afghanistan, I understand you mean the Taliban's, right? Because it's not about investing in government or stable institutions, but rather helping terrorists to build up. Okay, sorry for the inconvenience. Sure. So I would say again, what I pointed, it's not only about states, but also non-state actors. So also terrorist groups, lone wolves, some radical groups, religious nationals all over the world. China, having their values core, they don't have any problem with selling weaponry or building up very unstable countries, because they can step in and bring their own people who will follow their rules. We already witnessed that in Africa. Now what is happening in Oceania, some part of it. So Middle East, of course, and helping them being dependent financially on drugs, opium, but also cocaine in Central America and South America. This is again something that China is very well aware where to strike and where to use. What is at the local level, how people get money, what kind of resources they have, what can be misused. Also in the Pacific, tuna, that's the resource. That's very often the only resource of protein. So that's why they can overfish those areas, because what else those tiny little islets can have when it comes to resources. So we can move on. And again, we should not have our, one size fits all scenario, but to every country or state, they would be more than happy to use the situation for their own benefit.
So Albert asks, when it comes to lawfare or giving the international courts more bite, what can be done to ensure that added enforcement abilities given to international courts isn't also abused by authoritarian states?
It is abused, and it's not that, as I said, like us, Western world versus authoritarian regimes, because there is a whole spectrum of countries in between, like Saudi Arabia, for example, or countries in Africa. They will even sustain from voting against Russia, but again, they are like not helping to move on with, for example, establishing a resolution, so the highest international law norm. So from this point of view, I would say we do need to change the entire system of international law, in a sense that maybe I will compare it to Star Wars, that we do need a global government which would be able to impose international law, because so far international law is based on the free will of states. If states want to enter a certain treaty, also establishing treaty of tribunal like International Criminal Court, they are free to do so, but also they are free to withdraw from that court. What Russia did after unflattering ruling to withdraw its armed forces from Crimea in 2014. So in a sense that we need this change. Regrettably for Ukraine, those ideas they came to surface because previously international lawyers were pinpointing that, well, maybe we should change. This is high time to change that. But again, maybe unfortunately Ukraine is not enough for other countries to understand that yes, there is a big threat, and we must be prepared not only military, strategically, but also legally for this future battle.
This will be the last one, I think. What about the future of Taiwan, and secondly, Hong Kong? New rules implementing by China, and please also share the security in Korea Peninsula. Thanks. So that's a big question for just a few more minutes, but if you want to touch on that quickly.
It is, and I think that's a separate podcast. I am happy to do so. So maybe we will leave that now, because. But this is a great example that China doesn't have to step in military. They can just block international law and legal institution, and they already have their goal done. So that's the lawfare China mastered, and we still are back after them.
So I think like any blockbuster movie, we ended on a cliffhanger to ensure that we have a
Indeed,
sequel
I
later
won,
on.
baby.
It's great. Do you have any other closing comments as we come to the end of the chat?
End of the chat, I repeated that, and I will repeat now that Europe itself solo is too weak. We need the US, we need your support, and we must change our pivot back to Euro-Atlantic zone. We must rebuild those connections because we are too vulnerable to be solo, pretend that we are neutral because we are not. And our politicians must stop be blind when it comes to Chinese threat. So again, very happy to be here, to be invited, re-invited again to talk about future scenarios because we can now prevent those things. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for spending the time with us. Very much appreciated, and good job leading yourself into another episode with the cliffhanger there at the end. So with that, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you all for coming and participating and for some great questions. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.